Amen. Well, let's get into the word tonight. What I want to talk about tonight, I want to talk about us being ambassadors. And I've been thinking a lot about this because um, as I as I as I watch TV and I watch advertisements on TV, I am constantly I'm gonna say astounded and sometimes even shocked at the advertisements on TV and what the world thinks is normal. Like, I had a great mom. I mean, she was a wonderful mom. She really cared for us kids. And you could tell it just in life, just that she cared for us. And yet on TV, here's this mother and she's with her cat and her child falls down and gets hurt and she get a Band-Aid, but I'm bleeding, get two. It's like, I watch an ad like that and I'm like, are you kidding me? You're a mom, your child falls down and your child is bleeding and you're going to sit there and play with your cat rather than, and that's normal in the world. And there's all kinds of weird advertising. I call that weird. I mean, if that isn't weird to you, it sure is weird to me that a mother would care more about her cat than her child. Um, I don't even know what to say about that. It's so weird to me. But it exemplifies the point that I want to make tonight, which is that the world is becoming less and less godly, less and less aware of what is godly, and more, what does it say in the prophets, that they call evil good and good evil. And this shows up in the music that people are singing. It shows up in the TV and in the culture. It shows up in the t-shirts that people wear. Coming out of Bloomington, which was a college town, what people had on the front of their t-shirts, I'd be like, you got to be kidding me. In a million years, I wouldn't think about wearing something like that in public, and yet it's no big deal to say all kinds of horrible, nasty things and just advertise it to the whole world. And then I got to thinking about that in terms of you and I being ambassadors and reaching other people, and how we've got to really kind of ratchet down what we expect people to be able to receive. And that if we're, because, yeah, I can blast somebody with the truth about where the dead are and how people that aren't saved are going to burn and get hit and burn up. And I can blast people with a lot of these truths, and I can pat myself on the back and say, boy, I sure told them the truth, and they aren't born again. And one of the things that astounded me as I was preparing for this teaching and reading different records, what record is going to work, what record is going to fit, what record is going to really bring out what I'm trying to say here, I was really constantly amazed at the number of times in the scripture that the prophet or the person, or whether it was Jesus Christ or whether it was Paul or whether it was Peter, could have blown somebody away with the truth that they knew, and they just gave them the food that they could digest. And I got to thinking about that in terms of the presentation we make as ambassadors. That when it talks about ambassadors, we're still trying to get on the same page as the other person. And we'll see that in scripture. First of all, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where we read about us being ambassadors. And where does our impetus come from anyway to help people? Well, for one thing, we just try to love like Christ loves. But also verse 11 of 2 Corinthians 5, therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we are persuading others. These unbelievers, they don't know how bad things are going to be for people who aren't saved, but I do. And that should impel me out of my love and concern to do the best I can to reach people, to try to help them down the checkerboard a little bit and come closer to Christ. And he says in verse 16, so then, from now on, we regard no one according to the flesh, even though we've known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him that way no more. verse 17, so then, if anyone is in union with Christ, he's a new creation. The old things have passed away. Look, things have become new. And that's true on a spiritual level, but it's also supposed to be true on a physical level, that when you come into union with Christ, you begin to think and act like Christ did. And Christ always put the other people first, and he tried to reach them on that level. Okay, I'm not sure what that was, Rob, but anyway. So the verse 18, but all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave to us the ministry of reconciliation. And when God gave us the ministry of reconciliation, then we have it. We can use it or we can misuse it. It's like speaking in tongues. We can speak in tongues and use it, or we can speak in tongues and misuse it. With the ministry of reconciliation, we can use it and really try to win and really do our best to win other people, get on the same page with them, do what it takes to really reach them, or we can misuse it and just basically try to one-upmanship, beat people up with the truth, whatever it happens to be. And then, of course, along with the ministry, verse 19, that is that God was reconciling the world to himself through Christ. And obviously there's a lot in that Christ was sacrificial. For those of you that, do the Latin thing, witty wiki wincy, I came, I saw, I conquered. And Michael Card did a song about Jesus Christ. He came, he saw, he surrendered all. And that's really what he did. He came, he saw, he could have kicked tail. He came, he saw, he sacrificed himself. And that's really what God is saying here. He was reconciling himself through the world through Christ. And then it says, not counting their transgressions against them. Okay, then I've got to go in the same place in my mind. If I'm going to be like Christ, I've got to go into the same place, that I'm not looking at somebody and pointing out in my mind their transgressions. I've got to be looking at them saying, okay, what's it going to take to get on the same plane with them, so that my conversation, my actions are as acceptable as they can be within the realm of godliness and morality. So obviously we don't become immoral just because somebody else is. We don't become ungodly just because somebody else is. But there's a lot of flexibility as to how we can be. God wasn't counting their transgressions against them. Instead, what he was doing was having Christ sacrifice himself. And there is, and I love that in the prophecy tonight, because God knew what I was going to teach. And so what did I do with my page on the prophecy? That, that there's that God's a God of law and justice, and things will be taken care of. Why don't I have to worry about taking care of things now? Because God says he's going to take care of things. In Romans chapter 12, he says, you don't have to repay evil for evil, because I'm going to repay. So as long as we trust God for that, everything's going to be fine in the end. We can be as sacrificial as Christ. And he's committed to us the word of reconciliation. And of course, that's not only the Bible, but it's the revelation that we receive to get people born again. But it's primarily the Bible, but basically, you're with somebody and you're casting about what to say, and God puts a sentence in your mind and you speak it, and it changes a person's life. It changes a person's attitude. They change from darkness to light. That's the word of reconciliation too. Verse 20, therefore we are ambassadors on behalf of Christ. And so we represent God's kingdom. Well, if we're going to represent God's kingdom, how is God's kingdom? Well, God's a God of love. God's a God who sent Christ to sacrifice. God is a God who didn't hold their transgressions against them. So God's trying his best to reach people in all kinds of different ways. And so we're ambassadors, God, as it were, making his appeal through us. And that's exactly right. We're fellow workers with God. We're co-workers. And God appeals to the world through us. We implore on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. And that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that, we're going to make mistakes in this. I've made plenty of mistakes in this. But as the world becomes less Christian, as the world thinks less godly, as the world becomes more strange in the way they think, at least according to the standards that I see in the Bible, then I'm going to have to ratchet down kind of what I'm expecting of people as far as what they can hear from me, and not blow them away with the truth, but really in my heart of hearts search out what would this person need to come closer to God or to see the love of God. And of course, obviously in that there's a lot of love. We're showing people love, we're showing people concern, that kind of thing. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and we are going to start in verse 19. And this is the Apostle Paul. And it's interesting that the Apostle Paul, of course, we know his background was a Jew. And so he had all this Jewish background, and now he's chosen to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And boy, I tell you, you talk about two groups of people that think totally differently. The Jews, they have all these rules and regulations very tightly. No work on the Sabbath, don't eat meat with the blood, get circumcised when you're a kid, you circumcise your babies, you don't cut the corners of your beard. There's all these regulations for Jews. And the Gentiles, oh my gosh, they were profligate. There was sex everywhere. You could eat anything you wanted to. You want to drink blood, fine, whatever. So you've got two completely separate cultures. And I can imagine Paul, when God, the Lord told him, I'm making you an apostle to the Gentiles. He's like, what? What? Why would you do that? Why would you do that to me, God? Send me off to some Jewish settlement. But so he goes to the Gentiles, and then he talks about this because it was a challenge in verse 19. For though I was free, a slave to no one. That's where he was in his heart. That's where he was in his life. I made myself a slave to everyone. That's sacrifice. See, when we talk about coming and sacrificing, that's sacrifice. And that takes great humility. So you've got to really feel comfortable in your own skin to go there. I'm going to say that I struggle with this as much as anybody I know, because boy, it is really easy for me to be judgmental, and it's very difficult for me to just kind of accept people where they are and not be bothered by sinful behavior. And it's not that I'm not bothered by it. That's probably the wrong way to say it. It's just that it's their life. They're not even saved. I mean, who cares if they're drunk, if they're going to burn up in Gehenna? It's like the first thing you got to do is get them to where they're not going to burn up in that Gehenna, where they're going to live forever. And then you can talk to them about, so how'd it go last night with like getting drunk and then throwing up all morning? Was that like, or whatever it happens to be, but figuring out how to reach into somebody's life, and so Paul, who says he was a slave, he makes the point, I wasn't a slave to anybody. And then he says, but I kind of figured out that if I was going to win people, I had to be a slave to everybody. And so I did that so I could win even more. Verse 20, and to the Jews, I became like a Jew. Well, he already was a Pharisee, so that wasn't so hard. But if you look at all the crap that the Jews believed that wasn't even true, I mean, Jesus Christ, Matthew 15, confronts the Jews with full knowledge. You reject the commandments of God and keep your tradition. And what's Paul saying here? He's not saying it's easy to be a Jew, like the Jews are so godly and so righteous in keeping the law. No, the Jews were keeping their traditions, which were invented, they were made up. And what's Paul say? Well, I did my best to fit into that culture. Why? Why would I do that? So that I win Jews. Oh, yeah, that's a good reason. To those who are under the law, I became like one under the law. Not being myself under the law. That's what I mean about being comfortable in your own skin. He knew who he was. He knew what he believed. He just needed to fit into the best of his ability to get on the same page so he could bring people out of the bondage they were in. And then he says, so I could win those who are under the law. To those who are lawless, which would include the Gentiles, but also maybe Jews that had thrown off any idea of law, I became like one without law, not being without law to God. Again, see, this is the heart. There's such a difference between what's in your heart and mind and what you have to say to other people. You know, in the world today, um, it's like keyboard courage. It's what people say on Facebook or what people say on texts or in emails or something like that. And it just, basically burns your fingers. But it doesn't win people. Today there's this thing like, well, I'm important. I have to express myself. I think if Christ had done this, none of us would be here. He'd say, you know what? I don't feel like saving any of you people. That's just, that's, but he didn't do that. And we don't have to express ourselves. We have to express the love and concern of God. And hopefully that's going to actually come out of an honest heart. And he says, I became without law so that I could win those without law. Verse 22, to the weak, I became weak so that I win the weak. What does that mean? What's it mean to be weak? It doesn't mean to be physically weak. But for example, I taught in a Baptist church one time in East Tennessee, and I got a call from the guy that invited me there to teach. And he said, John, he said, when you come, you wear a dark suit, a starched white shirt, a narrow dark tie, and black leather shoes. And if you're teaching the word and you're not dressed like that, I don't care if you're Jesus Christ, they're not going to believe you. It was real simple, that a minister of the gospel looked this way. And so I had a choice. I can either say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to live under those constraints. Those are really stupid and they're legalistic and they're this and that and the other thing. And I wouldn't have got to teach the word. As it was, I got on my starched white shirt, my dark suit, my tiny little tie, and my black leather shoes. And I went in there and I taught the word. Everybody loved it. And I'm sure there were people that became closer to Christ because of that. And Paul says, he's going to be with some people and they're not going to eat meat. He's going to be with some people and they're not going to drink wine. And he's going to be with some people and they're not going to do this or that or whatever it is they're going to do or not do. And he just says, so to the weak, I became weak. Why? So that I could win the weak. It's just, if people are offended by your drinking alcohol in their presence, you don't have to drink. It's not a big deal. It's just how we learn to live. And this shows up in a lot of different ways. It shows up in the way we dress, our public presentation, what we feel like we have to tell other people about the truth that we know, how we pray, that we don't pray like that Pharisee in the temple, that we beat people up, if you will, with our prayers. He says, I'm in 22, I become all things to all people so that by every possible way, I save some. And I do these things for the good news sake, so that I can be a joint participant in it. And that's what we want to be. That's really all we want to be. We want to be joint participants. I want to go to Matthew chapter 9. And I want to talk about, Jesus Christ is an example of this, because I think he really was. And like I say, there's, let's see, where did it get off to? Starting in verse 9, the calling of Matthew. And again, you and I could find a dozen places where this is exemplified. I picked this one because I think it does a super job of exemplifying how Jesus Christ taught just enough. I think about what Jesus Christ could have taught these people. So, this is the calling of Matthew by Jesus Christ. And verse 9, Jesus was teaching people up in the Galilee. And then verse 9 is Jesus passed by from there. So he's probably walking on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. He saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax office. And the reason the tax office was right there was because when the fishermen came in the morning and they had a boat of fish, you You're not going to trust them to come to you later in the afternoon, walk a half a mile inland and come to you and say, I caught 40 fish this morning. Well, those tax officers were right there at the dock. They were counting those fish. They were taking their share. Absolutely. They're gonna make sure that they get their share. And so he's walking by the tax office. There's Matthew sitting at the tax office. And he says to him, and it had to be partly a walk by revelation, but partly because he paid attention to the fact that it's sometime in the past, this just wasn't out of the blue. Like Matthew said, wow, that's a good idea. Never thought about it. That Jesus and Matthew had at least seen each other or had some kind of relationship, or there was some kind of way that they had gotten together and talked. And he says to him, follow me. And my gut feeling is, for Matthew, that might have been very startling in a way, because if you knew how tax collectors worked, it was the tax collectors were Jews and they worked for the Romans. And because they were taking money from fellow Jews, they were really hated. And that's why we always get that saying, tax collectors and sinners. In the King James, publicans and sinners. Why are the tax, you think about all the different things that could go with the word sinners, and yet they picked tax collectors. Why? Because they worked with the Roman government hand in hand, and generally speaking, they had to be somewhat dishonest. They had to be hard-hearted, take things from people that really couldn't afford to pay the taxes and this and that and the other thing. And so it got thrown in tax collectors and sinners. And so it may be that Matthew, it didn't really occur to him that he could be one of Christ's close followers. That's a possibility here. And Christ sees him sitting there and says, follow me. And Matthew's like, I'm in. And he got up and followed him. And verse 10, it came to pass as he reclined to eat in his house. And then we find out from other gospels that Matthew invited his friends. Matthew was excited. He believed in Jesus Christ. He didn't know he was the Messiah at this time, but he believed, here's a great man again. Here's a prophet. Here's somebody who knows some of the truth of God. This is a man that does miracles. He'd done a bunch of miracles before this. And so what does Matthew do? He invites all of his friends. Well, who are they? They're all the tax collectors and sinners. Matthew didn't go down to the synagogue and collect, like the upper crust of the synagogue. He gets Jesus Christ, the Messiah, and gathers up all these tax collectors and sinners. And so they recline to eat in the house. And look, many tax collectors and sinners, there's the two together. Many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And what are they doing? They're chatting. Now, think about what Jesus Christ could say at that dinner. He could say, well, you guys know I'm the Messiah, right? And I'm going to leave the earth here and gather up armies from heaven and come back and kick tail. And if you guys remain sinners when I come back, you're part of it. I mean, he could have gone on and all. Would you want anybody? No. Would he have been speaking the truth? Yes. Would you want anybody? No. And I think, man, if you wrote a play, it would be interesting to see the dialogues that could develop out of this about Jesus Christ, just kind of plumbing people's hearts by asking questions and talking about, did they believe Yahweh? Did they believe the Bible? And talking about simple truths that they could grasp, and not condemning them. I mean, what they did in life was distasteful at best. And Jesus Christ could have said, y'all better quit this, the judgment of God, but he didn't. And he was winning the tax collectors and sinners. And interestingly enough, now come in the people who should have saddled up beside him and say, wow, you're really good at this. We want to see how you're doing it. We're trying to get people to come to synagogue. We're trying to be nice to people. We're trying to get people to follow the law. You seem to be doing a better job than we are. So we'd like to learn from you. But no, instead, verse 11, when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, they wouldn't even go to him. Heaven forbid. Are you kidding? Be that honest. When this is his disciples, why is your teacher eating with tax collectors and sinners? You see, this is what I'm talking about when we're so comfortable in our skin that we can be with people and know that we're not, it isn't hurting us to not tell them every truth that we know. We're there to show them love, show them care, show them concern, maybe answer a few questions. If not, ask a few questions. Just get them to feel more accepted. I mean, there's so many different ways we can reach people. And I'm sure that's what Jesus was doing here. And they, why are your teacher eating with tax collectors and sinners? Verse 12. Well, eventually Jesus heard it, but when he heard it, verse 12, he said, it is not those who are well that need a physician, but those who are sick. Oh yeah. See, I teach the truth hard to you guys. You are well. So you don't need a doctor, you need a teacher. You need to maybe know the Bible a little better than you know, or there may be some questions that you have that you need to get figured out or whatever. And because of your giving to Spirit and Truth, then I get to spend my life reading commentaries and doing the background work that would answer questions and help you down the checkerboard. But if I'm meeting with a bunch of unbelievers, they need a doctor. They need somebody who just shows them care, who can draw out, draw out who they really are, what they really want, what are their real aspirations, do they feel loved, what would it take for them to feel loved and cared for, what would it take for them to say maybe there is a God, maybe there is a Jesus Christ, maybe I could live forever, this kind of thing. And I'm not even sure I'm doing it right, because I'm not a called pastor, but I tell you, you get somebody with some of these people that are called pastors and they're fantastic with people. It's just astounding. And don't follow me. And I am not a called pastor, so I have a harder time. But he says, but so honest. It's not those who well need a physician, but those who are sick. Verse 13, and I love this, but go and learn what this means. I want mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous. That's tongue in cheek, because when he says, I didn't come to call the righteous, he's talking to the Pharisees who say they're righteous but aren't, but they thought they were. And here again, if Christ were to tell the Pharisees, I didn't come to call the righteous, but it's not you. All they would have been offended and walked away. So Christ is just explaining to the Pharisees, why am I eating with tax collectors and sinners? Because I didn't come to call righteous people like you. I came to call sinners. And in saying that, he was comfortable. That's what they believed. And, that's what they would act on. And who knows, that might move. If they thought, yeah, I'm righteous, well, then I can afford to give a little bit, this kind of thing. But go and learn what this means. I want mercy and not sacrifice. Where does that come from? And why does that apply here? And it comes out of Hosea. And it applies here because the Pharisees were just like the people in Hosea's time who were being so pedantically religious in their sacrifices and in their keeping of the religious statutes, except they just completely missed the heart of the law and mercy. So let's go to Hosea, and we'll go to Hosea 6:6. In fact, I'll tell you what, let's back up and pick up some of the context of this. So in Hosea chapter 6, we'll start in verse 4. And in verse 4, God, the prophet speaking by revelation, Ephraim is the northern kingdom, sometimes called Samaria, sometimes called Israel. Ephraim, what am I going to do with you? Judah, what am I going to do with you? For your covenant loyalty is like a morning cloud, and like the dew that disappears early. Now, the morning cloud is a promise. You wake up in the morning, it's been the dry season. It could start to be the rainy season. You see a cloud in the morning, you're like, yes, it might actually rain today. And you get really excited about the potential and having rain and watering the ground, and then the thing evaporates. So it's like promises that aren't fulfilled. And the dew that disappears early instead of staying and watering the plants. Verse 5, therefore I have cut them to pieces by the prophets and killed them by the words of my mouth. For my judgments go forth like the light of dawn. In other words, they just get stronger, they come on, and they move powerfully. And what he's saying here is that the prophets spoke words that if obeyed, people would change. But because they don't change and they diss the prophets, then they get consequences. And then he says in verse 6, for I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. And this is something that we can pay attention to today, because periodically you run into religious people that they're very hard on others about their religion. You know, they're very condemning of people that don't do what they do, don't believe like they believe. And God says, look, I want mercy and not sacrifice. You know, there's truth and there's error. And you and I need to know God and know the truth. But incumbent in that is I can know the truth and be comfortable in my skin without denigrating someone that doesn't know it. You know, and that's because that's the opposite side. That becomes religion. You know, and he says, you know, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Don't come to me with your bulls and stuff if you're not giving mercy. And the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. And it's interesting because in the religious world, there are a lot of people that, my goodness, they are so exacting in they're going to go to church and they're going to pray and they're going to do this and they're going to do that and they're going to do the other thing. And it's not that those things aren't good things. They are good things, but it's the attitude with which you hold them. If they become, I'm righteous because of that, and then you look down your nose at everybody who doesn't do that, see, that misses the point. There's no mercy there. And it's not our job anyway. We're not the judges, you know. And then he goes on to breaking the covenant. Now, when he says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings, you know, this comes up in all of the prophets that wrote about this time period. For example, if you look at Hosea chapter 1, verse 1, you know, Hosea prophesied in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. You read Isaiah chapter 1, and he says he prophesied in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So they were contemporaneous. Let's take a look at Isaiah chapter 1. Now, what's going on in Isaiah chapter 1? He's got the same kind of message. He doesn't mention mercy here, but he's got the same kind of message about what happens if you're religious, but you don't live out the basic tenets of the religion of love and mercy and giving and kindness. He says in verse 10, hear the word of Yahweh, you rulers of Sodom, listen to the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Now he's talking about Judah, but he calls them Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness. And then he says, what are the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says Yahweh. I've had enough of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed animals. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or he-goats. And what's God saying? Well, yeah, you're bringing all these sacrifices, but without love and concern and care, then, you know, you're missing the whole point. He says, verse 12, when you come to appear before me, who has required this at your hand, this trampling of my courts? Do not bring your worthless offerings anymore. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon, Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I can't endure iniquity with the solemn assemblies. And so what God is saying here is the same thing he said in Hosea. You know, your sacrifices, if you're not living a godly life, if you think you can cover for that by your religious offerings, you're missing the point. Christ would express this when he said, you know, if you're going to law with your brother and you remember, you know, that somebody has an offense against you, stop where you are and go and heal that first. You know, take care of people's hearts first. And that's what's going on here. And I want to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, we see the Apostle Paul. And this is kind of where, I started and where I want to conclude, which is, when we're with people, what do we say to them? What do we point out to them? Because the Apostle Paul knew a boatload of truth. By the time he wrote Corinthians, he knew a boatload of truth, and he could have said a lot of things to those Corinthians, but they were Greeks. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They believed in an eternal soul. They had all kinds of weird beliefs, the Greeks did. Plus, they were sexually profligate, and they, all, yeah, they were pretty ungodly people, frankly. Drinking fests and all kinds of stuff. So in verse 1, Paul writes, "And I, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the sacred secret of God." Verse 2, "For I decided not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." And that's what I mean about a simple message. As I look at the world around me, it's getting stranger and stranger. The people of the world know less and less about God, and they seem to think less and less correctly about him, and they call evil good and good evil. So if I hit them with too much truth, it goes off the point. It just creates confusion and people walk away. Where here the Apostle Paul, he's dealing with a very similar situation. People that don't think in the things of God. They weren't trained that way. They weren't raised that way. It wasn't their culture. So what does he say? He says, well, I just made up my mind that what I was really going to focus on was Jesus Christ and him crucified, to make sure that you understood that somebody loved you enough they would die for you. And if you believe in him, you would live forever. That's pretty cool. And he says in verse 3, "I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of spirit and of power." Like, for example, you talk about speaking in tongues. Verse 5, "So that your trust should not stand in human wisdom, but in the power of God." And then he goes on in verse 6, and he said, "We do speak wisdom among those who are mature." And so this is where we use wisdom in our speech. Who are we with, and what can they hear? And what would bring them closer to Christ? What would drive them farther away? And that's really, as ambassadors, that's really what we want to do, where we want to be, that in this these really, really interesting times, that we are thinking about what we need to say, how we need to be, so that we can really reach others and be concerned about that. And then I feel very strongly that God will guide us and help us along the way. So that's what I wanted to share tonight, and I appreciate your attention. And I think the world needs us. The world needs us a lot. So let's carry the ball down the field and win some souls for Christ.